This presentation gives a short history to the discussions in the International Maritime Organization on greenhouse gas emissions reduction and an overview of what is included in the IMO's roadmap and the initial strategy to reduce emissions from ships. This provides some context for the debates currently happening in the IMO and in coming years, given the urgency with which we need the global economy to decarbonise if we are to have any chance of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. In 1997, Article 2.2 of the Kyoto Protocol gave the International Maritime Organization the mandate to pursue limitations or reductions of greenhouse gas emissions, and MARPOL Annex 6 was amended to include CO2 emissions as well as other forms of pollution from international shipping. Resolution 8 asked the Marine Environment Protection Committee to look into strategies that the IMO could adopt to reduce CO2 emissions and what might be feasible given other atmospheric and marine pollutants from ships. Resolution 8 also invited the IMO to work with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, and undertake a study to provide a baseline of global international shipping emissions and to calculate the sector's share of the global CO2 inventory. The first study was published in 2000 and found that international shipping made up approximately 1.8% of total global emissions based on 1996 data. In 2003, the Assembly adopted a resolution urging the Marine Environment Protection Committee to identify and develop mechanisms to limit or reduce greenhouse gas emissions from international shipping. The second study, published in 2009, estimated emissions of 880 million tonnes based on 2007 data, or about 2.7% of global totals. In 2011, the Marine Environment Protection Committee added a new chapter to MARPOL Annex 6, which included mandatory energy efficiency standards for ships greater than 400 gross tonnes, including the Energy Efficiency Design Index, or EEDI, for all new ships, and Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plans, or SEMPs, for all ships that would come into force in 2013. The EEDI sets the minimum energy efficiency of new ships depending on their type and size based on the work done by the ship. For example, emissions of CO2 per tonne mile. Initially, the EEDI has developed standards for the most energy-intensive and largest ships, which sees increasing levels of energy efficiency to be attained by new ships over time, with ships in 2025 having to be at least 30% more energy efficient than those that were built in 2014, for example. In 2016, the Marine Environment Protection Committee agreed to review the EEDI and in 2019 decided to bring forward the date by which energy efficiency requirements for some ship types, specifically container ships, general cargo and LNG tankers, need to be achieved from 2025 to 2022 and increasing the level of efficiency to be achieved. For example, container ships of 200,000 deadweight tonne or over need to be 50% more energy efficiency by 2022. Previously, it had been 30% more by 2025. Ship energy efficiency management plans require the ship operators to cost-effectively improve the energy efficiency of existing ships compared to their business-as-usual operations, and also provides a means for the IMO to monitor ship and fleet efficiency over time. The third IMO greenhouse gas study, published in 2014, found that emissions were about 796 million tonnes based on 2012 data, or about 2.2% of global totals. This third study also updated the data for 2007 presented in the second study, increasing the historical emissions to 885 million tonnes, or 2.8% of totals. The fourth study is due to be considered by the Marine Environment Protection Committee in November 2020 and has already been released to IMO member states and shows that emissions for the period of 2012 to 2018 continued the trend of increasing emissions, raising to approximately 3% of total global greenhouse gas emissions, or 1,076 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. Of particular note, the fourth greenhouse gas study found that emissions of methane had increased by 151%, due primarily to the increased use in LNG. The fourth study also, for the first time, considered emissions of black carbon, which, because this is a particulate and not a gas, has been a controversial matter. However, black carbon is important in terms of climate change because of the impact it has, with some IMO members arguing black carbon should be included, considering how important it is as a pollutant, and others arguing that because it is not a gas, and that the IMO strategy is about greenhouse gas emissions reduction, that it should not be considered. In 2015, the Republic of the Marshall Islands lodged a submission to the Marine Environment Protection Committee calling for the IMO to adopt ambitious decarbonisation targets for the sector in line with a 1.5-degree pathway. However, the committee decided to decline the request and instead waited to see what happened in the UNFCCC negotiations. The Paris Agreement was agreed later that year, with the long-term temperature goal being to keep the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, recognising that this would substantially reduce the risks and impacts of climate change. In 2016, after the Paris Agreement had been reached and global temperature targets set, the committee agreed to a roadmap for developing a comprehensive IMO strategy on reducing GHG emissions from ships. And then, in 2018, the committee adopted an initial strategy which included levels of ambition as well as an overarching vision to reduce emissions from international ships, with a revised strategy to be finalised in 2023. Follow-up actions were also agreed, and in 2019 a procedure for undertaking impact assessments for measures that might be adopted was put in place. The IMO roadmap for developing a comprehensive IMO strategy on reduction of greenhouse gas emissions from ships has a three-step process made up of collection and analysis of data on fuel used by individual ships. This data will then be used to determine what measures are needed to reduce emissions from ships. The initial strategy is the first milestone set out in this roadmap. There has been an ongoing debate between IMO members as to whether the data collection system should be completed before any measures are adopted, that is Phase 3, with most arguing that there is already sufficient data to show that emissions reduction measures need to be adopted as soon as possible, and that delaying until the data collection system is completed is a red herring. MARPOL Annex 6 applies to all ships flagged to a signatory state to MARPOL Annex 6 or sailing within the territorial waters of a signatory state. Whilst MARPOL applies to all these ships, regulations under MARPOL Annex 6 can limit the ships that are required to comply with those specific regulations. Sometimes these limitations are expressed by when the ship was constructed, and sometimes by ship size, measured by gross tonnage or length. For example, the roadmap process was agreed to at MEPC 70 in October 2016 by amending MARPOL Annex 6 to introduce the data collection system for fuel oil consumption of ships, containing mandatory requirements for ships to record and report their fuel oil consumption. Ships of 5,000 gross tonnes and above, which represent approximately 85% of total CO2 emissions from international shipping, are required to collect consumption data for each type of fuel oil they use, as well as other data including proxies for transport work. As each individual measure is developed, IMO members would then determine which ships must comply with that measure. It may be that some measures limit their application to ships, whether that is limited by when they were built or by their size, in order to avoid disproportionate negative impacts. However, If emissions are to reduce in line with a trajectory of no more than 1.5 degrees, then all ships need to be included. MARPOL Annex 6, first adopted in 1997, limited the main air pollutants contained in ships' exhaust gas, including sulfur oxide, SOx, and nitrous oxides, NOx, and prohibits deliberate emissions of ozone-depleting substances. MARPOL Annex 6 also regulates shipboard incineration and the emissions of volatile organic compounds from tankers. MARPOL Annex 6 came into force in 2005. You can see that not all Pacific IMO members are signatories to MARPOL Annex 6 and the amendment, which entered into force in 2010, which introduced additional controls over nitrous oxides, sulfur and particulate matter, as well as emissions control areas. This slide shows the timetable of the various activities involved in developing the IMO comprehensive strategy to reduce emissions from shipping. Noting, of course, that due to COVID-19, the meetings that were scheduled for 2020, particularly the MEPC 75, have been postponed and since delayed.